Hello, everyone. My name is Julianna Link, and I'm a librarian here at the Belle Isle Library. I'd like to present some books for you to consider reading in honor of Pride Month, June 2020. If you don't get to them during Pride Month, that's perfectly fine. You can enjoy them anytime. I have 7 titles to talk about today. 2 are memoirs, 2 are novels that are really recent, 3 are really recent, and 2 are, the ones that we're going to start with, really unusual and beautifully done from award-winning novelists. Let's get started with those. The first one I'm going to talk about is Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. This is a graphic novel, and she's an award-winning graphic novelist. She's been doing this work since the 80s. You may have heard her last name, Bechdel, in reference to the Bechdel test. When you're watching a movie and there are 2 women speaking, are they speaking about a man? That means that movie has failed the Bechdel test. And this is the author for whom that phrase was named. This is a wonderful graphic novel. It has now been made into a stage play, actually a musical. So you may have heard of Fun Home in that context. This is an emotional graphic novel. I'm kind of generally unfamiliar with graphic novels, and I was deeply moved. It was much deeper than I thought it was going to be when I first started it. She has a biting humor, and she tells the story of her own life as a young girl and a teen at home with her father, who in the 70s was a gay man who was closeted. Now she is a gay woman who has the freedom not to be closeted, but living in the home is a challenge for everyone involved. They seem like a normal family, but underneath there's this tension between who he really is and who he feels he can be, and who she really is and how she wants to express her sexuality. So it's a complex story, but it's beautifully told, and uses this graphic novel format, of which she is a master. I'll just show you one page that I really appreciated her as an artist. I'm going to hold it up so that you can maybe see it on this Zoom page. This is a drawing of 2 photographs of her father and herself when they were at the same age. And I really appreciate how the artist is able to draw a picture that looks like a photograph in the middle of a graphic novel. It's remarkable. I'll tell you a little bit more about this story. Fun Home is named that because they live in a home that their grandparents ran a funeral home, so they put the fun in funeral home. That's pretty cool. And as she describes her interactions with her family, she mentions the funeral home and what an odd and macabre place it was for everyone to grow up next to. It's a surprising balance of story time, this book. Is it her story? Is it her father's story? It's both of them together. They have totally different outcomes, being from totally different generations. And she uses a really interesting juxtaposition of the graphic novel format and academic vocabulary. Here's an example. She, in any random sentence, here's one. Might not a lingering vibration, a quantum particle of rebellion still have hung in the humectant air? Okay, sent me to the dictionary. Humectant means humid, but this is how she speaks, is how the character speaks, it's how she thinks. And I don't expect that in a graphic novel character. I don't know why, but there it is. And I was moved by it. All the characters in this are talented, a little bit nerdy, and I was into it. I particularly like that photograph I held up. It just strikes me how good the illustration is. being drawn photos, and being different than the rest of the illustrations in the book. In the middle of the book, chapter 5, it's a really sad story about her own sort of beginning to process as a child the difference between herself and her siblings, and the difference between her dad and the rest of the men that she observes. She goes through a period of struggle with OCD, and she talks a lot about the natural world. They live out in the country and how the natural world is part of their routine. And it was a chapter in the book, a little bit more than halfway, that makes you just kind of stop of the story and the skill of this storytelling. This author does a particularly great job of showing those familiar relationships. The bickering between the siblings is very realistic. The expectations of parents to their children and the way they speak to their children is very real. And there's just a lot of moments in this story that are universal to all families. And the way that she tells the story of her extraordinary family and its tragedy, and in her case, her freedom, is really remarkable. So I hope you get a chance to look at Fun Home. The next novel I'd like to talk about for this book talk is On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, by an author called Vuong. This author is an award-winning poet, a professor of fine arts, and he's mostly known for poetry and maybe some short writing. And he is a winner of the MacArthur Grant. You may have heard of it, called the Genius Grant. And this novel reads like a memoir. You can tell, though, that this novelist is really a poet. It's like this book is a really long lyric poem. And you can also tell that he is influenced by modern poetry in the United States, rap music. There are parts of this story where the narrative just stops and he presents a poem about a loved one, and it's just remarkable. It's like a song in the middle of the book. His style of writing is very short, but a meaningful collection of words at a time. Nothing is wasted, nothing extra. A lot of modern poetry is very bare bones, and that's how his style is. It is hard to keep in mind as you read this that it's a novel and not a memoir, because it is so personal, and it tells a story of a family from the inside of its main character, a young son. He and his family are immigrants to the United States from Vietnam. And you don't even know his Vietnamese name in this book. He translates his name to Little Dog. And he doesn't say his own name very often. And so you kind of go through long sections of this book and you've forgotten his name. It is a story of him defining his own identity over long years of very great struggle. He also tells the story of his mother, his grandmother, and his first boyfriend. All of these people were extremely damaged. They struggle with great poverty. They struggle with lack of everything in life, not just material possessions, but lack of education, lack of just being able to go on in the world because of past abuse. And he's telling a story of how their struggles affected him. Here's an excerpt from the very beginning of the book. Listen to how it sounds like poetry. You're a mother, Ma. You're also a monster. But so am I, which is why I can't turn away from you, which is why I've taken God's loneliest creation and put you inside it. Look. So he tells his mother, I've written something. I've put you inside it. It's accurate to describe this novel as something very lonely. The protagonist of the novel, Little Dog, you're rooting for him like you would root for any main character that you care about but he doesn't really care about himself very much. And so it's an ugly story, and it's very sad and hard to read. Continuing. This story is sad, and it's a little hard to read. It's a brutal picture of a family who is really struggling, and a main character who is also struggling into his young adult life. He tells it with such remarkable English. He tells the story of his Vietnamese being frozen in time. He speaks Vietnamese as though he is a 5-year-old. And he forces himself to become very good at English to avoid embarrassing situations in English. He goes on to study English and to base his whole career on poetry and the use of this new language to him. But listen to what he does with it. Here's a sentence from early in the book. The girl's eye fills with the chopper in the sky, her face a dropped peach, her blue shawl finally made visible with black ink, like this. He describes a chopper in Vietnam as a dismemberment of air. So beautiful and so perfect for such an ugly, frightening thing to be standing under a helicopter. Yeah, experiences that most of us would never have had. During the course of his young life, little dog meets a boyfriend. He takes a job as a worker on a farm, on a tobacco farm, and he meets a lover. His name is Trevor. Trevor is quite an upper-crust name for such a sad and impoverished person. Yeah, Trevor lives with his father in a trailer, and they do migrant work. Trevor is a young white teen, and he's addicted to meth. And it's really sad. You get, again, a very brutal picture, a very realistic picture of sort of a hopeless person in a hopeless situation. And little dog and he have a rapport, and they have sexual encounters, but Trevor is constantly negative about that, constantly questioning him, constantly questioning himself, whether he wants this, whether it means that he is himself gay. Little dog doesn't have those kind of questions about himself, but he agrees to go along with Trevor and doesn't really argue, fight back, discuss anything about how they define themselves in their young lives. On page 118, little dog asks, "What do you call the animal that offers itself to eat?" Sometimes being offered tenderness feels like the very proof that you've been ruined. That's a really sad statement, and it comes from a place of abuse and overwhelming sadness, the emotion of a sentiment that is expressed in the novel Gilead. That's the last time I ran across it, where the main character came into a town and was offered generosity, and she was angry. She didn't know how to take people being nice to her, and it just reminded her that most people in her life had never been nice, and it reminded her what she had missed out on. It's a very powerful emotion to try to describe. Vuong describes it beautifully. The story is really just intense and unpleasant, but it forces a reader like me to examine, to look hard, and to see little dog. And I think that is the purpose of the story. Here is a person who longs to be seen. That's his only purpose. And it's beautiful in our ability as readers to recognize him and to recognize the artistry of the author who put these words together for us. We'll have to look for other writing and other novels in the future from this author. He is remarkable. Now I'd like to talk about a couple of memoirs that we can offer for Pride Month. These are books that people have written about their own lives. You may have read articles by this author, Saeed Jones. He comes from BuzzFeed. He writes occasionally for the New Yorker and other magazines. He writes poetry as well as articles. And he's written this book, How We Fight for Our Lives, about his own young life, his own exploration of his sexuality, his own coming out story. He is a very precise writer. You can actually feel, smell, hear everything he's talking about. He starts out as a kid talking about the hot weather in Texas. He grows up a lot with his grandmother. His mother's not around a lot when he's a little kid, but his grandmother raised him. She tightened her grip until it became so painful that I had no choice but to yank myself free. He knew there was something about himself that was a little different, and his grandmother was super religious and tried to pray the gay away, as they do, and it didn't work. He knew it wasn't going to work even as a kid, even at the time. As he began to age and become a teenager, he sought to explore his sexuality, and he sought the company of men who were older, a lot of white men who would be hanging around looking for young Black and Latino kids to have brief affairs with, not even a whole affair, just encounters with. But he began to identify with these men. He began to see them for what they wanted. And in recognizing that, he recognized his own role in those encounters. And he couldn't wait to go to college. He couldn't wait to be out and go to college and be more of an adult and to take more responsibility for himself. But when he gets to college, what happened? Just like that, I closeted myself again. No one shoved me back in there. It shouldn't have been that easy to unbecome myself. He just felt that in order to be accepted in his group in school, he shouldn't be out. And this became a great source of tension for him in his young life, to be closeted, but then also wanting to explore his sexuality. He went to college during the 90s, and he talks about what a hard time that was. Everyone he knew was very afraid of HIV at that time, and he wanted to rebel against that fear by having encounter after encounter after encounter and define and redefine his own role in his own life. By participating in constant hookups, he says he wants to be whatever they want me to be, but he wants to construct a fantasy about this string of lovers. This book has an interesting description of the narrator playing someone who's not himself. He feels far removed from himself. How he's participating vigorously in acting on his sexuality, he's still not himself. He doesn't really have a good sense of his own strength and his own reality. Here's an interesting quotation. Call yourself whatever you want. A man might still decide that when he looks at you, all he sees is an inward. He's constantly being insulted and degraded by people that he's going with, and that has an effect on him. And he begins to ask himself, what is it about me that I seek that out? Again, a problematic situation for us these days and for us to read about. But at the time, he was working it out. He was living it for himself. And he had to go through those really hard times in order to dig himself an identity for himself that was real. As this book progresses, we learn more and more about his mother, not just about himself. His mother also needed to be a better communicator to him and to herself. She didn't need to come out because of sexuality. She needed to come out and be more communicative about her own health. She's a person who struggled with heart disease, and she was just not going to make it. She was not going to live very long, and she couldn't talk about that. When he was a little kid, she never talked about it, and she never really wanted to talk about it. Okay, his mom never wanted to talk about her own health issues until the crisis was upon her. So he was participating in coming out, and she was also participating in a kind of coming out in a clear, real discussion of her own situation. So this is a book almost about the both of them in the end, about his own journey, his own definition of himself, and about his mom and how he loved her and how they were similar and very far apart at the same time. It really feels like a book, much like Fun Home, about the parent and the child at the same time. He's dedicated this book to his mom. There's a really great poem about her at the beginning, and he thanks his grandma at the end for her dedication and all her work that she has done to raise him. It's an extraordinary book in the fact that a lot of times people who have a coming out story, we might just hear the conclusion of it or a snippet of it, but this is a person who has tried to work this out throughout a whole book. And I hope you will give it a look, especially if those experiences are very different from your own. And that way you can have a really interesting picture of somebody's life that you may never have known about. Saeed Jones has a really strong presence on Twitter, and so if you want to read other writings on his and other articles, he's easy to find. The other memoir that we can talk about during Pride Month is this one, Redefining Realness by Janet Mock. This is a book that I had read a couple of years ago. It came out in 2014. Janet Mock is a trans woman, and this is her story about her young life and about her journey towards transition. The introduction of this book is really helpful. It's very clear. She works through a lot of vocabulary, and a reader like me needs that vocabulary. We don't want to insult anyone. We want to get the words correct. And that's kind of what this book is about. It's introducing the idea of trans femininity, how she talks about herself, and how we might all talk about our trans brothers and sisters in the most open and accepting way possible. She's really wanting everyone to make an effort to get this right. She's communicating her own story, but also educating us all about what this story is and what it isn't. And for herself, it's been a really detailed and really remarkable journey. She was raised in Hawaii. She spent some time in the Dallas area as well, but mostly she has a Hawaiian cultural background, which is fascinating. There is in Hawaiian culture, as in many indigenous cultures, a little bit more acceptance of an intersex human. In Hawaiian culture, it's called a mahu, M-A-H-U. She had grown up around two people that she knew who were growing up in this Native culture where Mahu is not a derogatory term, this is just reality. One of these people was a hula teacher, and one of these people was her best friend, Wendy. The definitions and the distinctions between trans women and other people of various sexualities in this story are fascinating. She really makes a real distinction between, of course, trans women and drag queens. And I liked their definition, which was very helpful. A drag queen is part-time for showtime. A trans woman is all the time. And I thought, oh, yeah, that's really, thank you. That was very helpful. And, a fun way that when you grow up trying to struggle to define yourself so that other people understand, this is a way to hit on it. Monk tells the story of her elementary school years and her junior high school years. Her home life was really chaotic. She had parents that were struggling economically. They struggled with drug addiction. And there were lots of kids, brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles around all the time, sort of rotating from house to house. And, when she was right in high school, she was able to explore transitioning from male to female in ways that I wouldn't have thought would have been so openly done. But no, it was open. She went to school one semester as Charles, and she came back the next semester as Janet. And people around her at school kind of knew that what was going on. She had two teachers that did not support that, but everyone else in her life understood it. They may not have supported it, but at least they spoke to her with respect. And I thought that was remarkable for such a young person to assert this. This was in the early 90s. And she's telling the story in 2014. I would struggle to find a story of that happening 20 years later. That is so gutsy of such a young person. And just making it work at a young age. She knew who she was, and she knew who she wanted to project in life. Not to say that it was a smooth journey, but at no point did Janet ever have a crisis of identity. She knew exactly who she was her whole young life. We weren't ready in the mid-90s, I think, for that kind of discussion, or at least for the distinctions of vocabulary that now are becoming more and more familiar to all of us. Through the end of chapter 8, Mock recognizes that this race and especially economic class have so much to do with how people are accepted. Gay or straight, trans or not trans, that has a lot to do. Those other social factors have so much to do with how you can move through life and how easy things are for you. I would also add that religion and geography, where you live, have a lot to do with that too. Mock is good throughout her memoir to recognize all the adults in her life who made things easier during her teen years: the hula teacher, the school counselor, her oldest sister Corey, her friend Wendy. They all accepted her. They all helped her at various points, at key points where they listened carefully and were extremely helpful to her. Here's something that she said that I thought was remarkable. As I was transitioning, I forgave early slips because they were a part of our collective growing pains. They, other people, reacted positively and grew accustomed at their own pace. The social transition is a process by which a trans person begins openly living in their true gender. And this was not a shock to a lot of people that she knew, but she got tired of having to explain it all the time. So I thought that was pretty interesting. She failed to realize that people outside her own home weren't equipped to talk about her and to accept her with the language that she wanted them to use. Janet Mock has been a real educator for me. I was really appreciative of the way she approached this book. This is a memoir, about her own life, but it's really for all of us, and I really appreciate that. She also describes it towards the end of her book, the process of her actual surgical transition, the fact that she had to earn money for that and then go and have it done in Thailand. This was a big struggle. There was not money for this. And the methods that she used to get that money, people judge. And she just lays it out. She just tells the story. She had a very good and supportive boyfriend. His name was Adrian. And she really lucked out with him because even when they first met, he wasn't really sure that she was a trans woman. And she had the benefit of his acceptance over time. In the last chapter, Janet Mock emphasizes that she likes to speak about issues of poverty and race that are barriers, as well as the transitioning process. It's good to know, and it's really, you can't leave that out if you're telling the story of a person in her position. Anyway, that's a really remarkable person to read about. You feel like you really get to know her in her young life. Redefining Realness. The last 3 books that I'd like to introduce are fun novels. Let's Talk About Love by Kann. Upright Women Wanted by Gailey. And Girl Manza by M.E. Girard. So let's talk about love. That book is fun. The main character in this book, Alice, is a person who defines herself as asexual. This is a person who is not attracted sexually at all. And this novel is also a romance novel. So you think, well, how is that possible? But it's possible because you just have to understand what asexuality is. And the main character's struggle in this book is to constantly have to define it and redefine it for herself, but really for everyone else. She is very aware of who she is, but she struggles to articulate. Alice, the main character, is very aware of who she is, but she struggles to articulate. What is asexuality? What does it mean for her? What does it mean for other people in her life? And how does she navigate her college years with this situation? It's not going to be a problem. She just has to understand it, and she wants us, the readers, to understand it too. At the beginning of this book, she has been rejected by a romantic partner and called a corpse. She's called unnatural. She's called incapable. Of course, this is very hurtful because she does love and she does desire, but she has no sexuality at all. And she struggles to tell her partner, male, female, either, what that feels like and how they can best love her. She has the added hurdle of not being able to define or explain what she needs. And she doesn't communicate clearly with people who really need to take in what she's talking about. And that's kind of what this whole book is about, is her finding someone who truly understands what asexuality is and how he, in this case, can be her partner. She has a really unusually close relationship with her 2 best friends, Feeny and Ryan. And as they grow together and they talk about getting married, she feels left out. And this is natural. This happens to all college-age people. You have people who pair up, and then the group of friends becomes a pair, and then an extra person. Everyone in that group struggles with it. And they kind of fight during this book. And the way they articulate how they feel about each other while trying to remain positive is very true to life. Alice comes from a family of very successful people. Her mom is really overbearing. She's pushing Alice to go to law school, to be a real academic star. Alice is really interested in home design. She's not really interested in law school. And she also is wondering, how am I going to say this? How am I going to define my own wants and desires to my mom about my career? Alice describes the first time she meets a beautiful young man called Takumi as having her body short circuit from stress. He is so beautiful and so great, she just can't handle it. It's a trustworthy definition of arousal versus attraction that she has with herself, but also in the course of the book, she has with a counselor. And the voice of the counselor defines for her some things, but pulls out of her own words of how she would define herself. She says, "It's not fair that I should have to want sex to have happiness." Her lack of wanting sex is, in her mind, not keeping her from the joy of romantic love. She needs a partner who also feels whole and happy without sex. Is Takumi the one? Well, I'll tell you, without too many spoilers, it worked out. And so you're rooting for this character the whole time. And if you want a sort of a happy story that is about college-age people who are defining and redefining themselves, this is a fun book for you to read. The last two novels we're going to talk about are really good for teen readers. One of them is not necessarily defined precisely as a young adult novel, but could be. It's called Upright Women Wanted. This story is a true mashup. It's a mashup of a dystopian world fantasy, of a Handmaid's Tale kind of a situation for the whole country, and a Western. So it's also got a lot of elements of it of the movie Mad Max Fury Road. So if you could picture a very dusty, very violent future where women are not valued and they're having to fight across the American West, this is the picture that this book drops you into. The author of this book, Sarah Gailey, describes themselves as they. They use they in their pronouns in the author's notes, and it also features a character, Sai, with they and their pronouns in the book. Not the main character, but someone important who comes along later. For myself, that's the first time I have seen that in a whole book, and so that was a nice surprise, really interesting. It was hard for me to get used to at first because I'm looking for a plural. I'm looking for two people instead of just one. So you have to get used to it if you're like me and new to that pronoun in prose. Like the novel 1984, the characters in this novel have always been at war. The history of how current structures are in place is erased. So they just have to jump in, and you are jumping along with them as the reader. We meet the main character, Esther, as she is being pulled out of a wagon. She has been hiding in a wagon. And we learn that she has escaped a very scary situation where her girlfriend was killed in a public place, like a hanging. It's very sad. And she has escaped. And she is riding in a wagon, trying to get away from her town to go to a bigger town to maybe seek some refuge. The people who find her are librarians. Librarians ride across the plains, and they deliver supplies to various towns. Also, they deliver contraband. Now, this is unknown to most people and unknown to Esther. So at first, she wants to appear very proper. She wants to use all the right words. She wants to present herself as a very virtuous and law-abiding citizen. But she quickly learns that the librarians are a network, and they provide contraband items, they provide unapproved reading materials, as well as what they're supposed to provide to all the towns that they that they visit. Esther in this book moves from a self-definition to a desire for self-determination by about page 100 in this short novel, about 200 pages long. By halfway through, we can see that it's an inner journey for her, as well as a physical journey from one space to another space. She's running to escape an arranged marriage. She has some traumatic flashbacks. Negative self-talk plays her, but she is actually a physical fighter. She comes through for a lot of action-packed sequences in this book. It's very cinematic. You can see this being filmed. And even though you don't have a strong concept of what Esther looks like, I just picture sort of a Western garb, long hair person, you definitely have a sense of herself. Like, she knows who she wants to be. She really wants to just get away from an oppressive town. All right. Then these librarians who pick her up, their names are, Bet and Lita. And they also pick up another group of 3 women. One of them is called Amity. And slowly we learn that Amity is a spy, and she is riding with the librarians to meet a specific person who's going to help them get better supplies and generators and take them out to different towns. They're part of the resistance of this terrible misogynist government that has clamped down over the West. Now, Esther is very frightened of Amity and what Amity means for them. She's made them all a target. So what's going to happen? They have kind of some conflicts about who's going to be saved, who's going to have to fight, who's going to have to run away. The fight comes to a head after Esther is betrayed and then strikes out on her own. She sort of gets made like a gangster after physically fighting and defeating men trying to keep them out of town, out of the big town. At the end, was there any doubt that Esther is going to take over the role of being the next generation of librarians? In my mind, no. She's a hero from beginning to end. You think that, her self-definition in this book is easy to foresee. And she really is a hero. So it's a real fun book. It's kind of a classic Western, and I hope that you'll enjoy it in its sci-fi and queer elements that make it really modern. Okay, the last novel I'd like to introduce for Pride Month is this one. This is a self-defined young adult novel called Girl Manza. It's by a Canadian writer called M.E. Girard, and she has written a novel where the protagonist M.E. Girard has written a novel where the protagonist is a teen girl in high school who is really well defined. She knows exactly who she is, and she is a person who is a lesbian and dresses and acts like a boy and wants to be very butch all the time. All of her friends are boys. She treats other girls like they treat them, like teenage boys. The girls are objects. The girls are cute, and you should go and talk to them. And her definitions of relationships to women are the same as the teenage boys that are all around her. And the story is really a story of her maturing out of that and not really defining herself. She's already really well defined at the beginning of the story. It's the other people around her who are learning how to accept her and learning what is possible. So it's set in the high school in an urban area, and it's really fascinating. And it's a great novel about manning up and what that means, taking courage, doing the right thing, even when it's really hard. What everybody thinks manning up is in the beginning of the novel, and what it actually is by the end, 2 different things. It's really good. everyone meanly questions Penn. They question, what are you? People don't treat her very gently. They treat her with very harsh language. They don't understand who she's trying to be. And she's a fighter. She's very physical and not a bully, but next to bullies, and is kind of a wingman to a bully called Colby. Colby controls all the kids in the group. He defines what loyalty is. They're like little junior gangsters. They're not really scary gangsters, but among themselves, they have a very tight-knit and well-defined gang with him as the head. When Colby first met Penn and they were little, he didn't really know she was a girl. They were playing hockey in the street. When he found out, he kept letting her play anyway instead of telling her to go inside. So she's been his fast friend all these years. This sad system of sort of gangsterized male loyalty that Penn plays into willingly, it says a lot really about internalized misogyny. She doesn't have the vocabulary to speak about it that way, but you can just see it. And it's great as the story progresses for her to grow out of that, and for the people around her to grow out of that too. Many of the teenage girls in this book don't have that problem. They have it together. So it's very interesting. Penn is confusing to other people, but she knows her own tastes. She knows herself very well, very solidly from a young age. She says, I'm not regular, I'm a glitch. But that's the most negative thing that she says about herself. In fact, in the middle of this book, she has the best mirror moment of really any character I've ever seen in a novel, where she's standing in front of the mirror, looking at her own body and feeling beautiful and feeling herself, not saying one negative thing about her. Who among us can do that? And so it was great to read a novel where the teen girl has such a great, self-caring, powerful moment in front of the mirror. Good job, M.E. Girard. I'm glad to read that. They also do a nice job in this book of defining a distinction made between feeling transgender and feeling this fully female butch lesbian girl. She knows who she is. She knows who she is not. She says aloud, I'm not trans. She has considered it and defines herself as not trans. And so that's really helpful, because to a reader like me, that might be confusing. And to other characters in the novel, it would have been confusing. So it's great that there's a little moment taken to say, now let me just tell you a little bit of a distinction. And I thought that was really strong. One of the female friends that comes through in this novel is a beautiful girl called Olivia. She had been Colby's girlfriend for a short time, and it becomes necessary for Olivia to feel that she needs to get an abortion. And it is scary and terrible for her to go through that alone. So Penn befriends her, and Penn goes with her and shows true friendship. Olivia demonstrates that even in her way, in her own style, she has to man up herself and go through a scary situation. As Penn befriends Olivia through this, she also meets Olivia's friend, Blake. Blake is a beautiful, typical teenage girl. You'd think that she's sort of femininity. And yet, Blake really likes Penn. She gives Penn lots of great signals about how she might like to date her. And Penn takes a moment to think about her own future. She doesn't want to have a traditional life that her parents from Portugal would love her to like. She wants this kind of a future. What if I want to dress sharp, go to college to study landscaping or plumbing, and meet a nice girl to be my wife? Now that's a nice, very clearly defined picture of Penn's own future. Can she get Blake to agree to this? Are high school kids ready to make those kind of plans? It's a great novel, and you're just rooting for her the whole time. She's such a strong character, and the quality women in this book are great. So it's a really fun YA novel. I'm really glad that they have such a positive character for people to read about. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this month's Pride Book Talk. There are many, many books available to you, of course, from the library system. And these highlights are just for this month. I hope they'll last you a little bit through the summer. Thank you for joining us.